This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's with great pleasure that I am here to introduce Professor Sir Deian Hopkin, who's had 43 years in HE, in higher education. He retired as the Vice Chancellor of London South Bank University in 2009. He's currently the President of the National Library of Wales, and he's Chair of the Wales Programme for the First World War Centenary, and is also an expert advisor to the First Minister of Wales on that centenary. He is a trustee of the IHR and was a co-founder of the Association for History and Computing back in the 1980s and the 1990s. And he certainly has expertise in those areas, although, as he told me earlier, it's been a while since he was actively involved in that. And it is with great pleasure that he's going to speak tonight about digitising World War I, challenges and opportunities. Please.
Well, Richard, I'm very grateful to you. Can I just say that this isn't the IHR as I remember it, but it's actually delightful that it's going to be recreated in a new form, particularly on a smaller scale, but we look forward to that enormously. Can I also say, it's been a long time since I did an IHR seminar. I can't remember the last time. I suspect it was with an audience about a third of the size of this one, and most of them had left by the time I'd finished. But I also am very grateful to you for explaining that, I crossed over the dark side a while ago, and as a result, my discourse has declined, my ability to communicate with academics has morphed, but genuinely my interest has not flagged. So, what I want to really talk about is a couple of things which may be of interest. And I'm really interested in this as a seminar because while I want to talk about the topic before you, I am well aware there are people in this room, people who I've worked with, who've got a lot to say about this subject because there is a theme here. It isn't just about the First World War and its digitization. I want to ask a broader question for those historians interested in the exploitation of digital material. Where have we come to? Where are we actually going? And that is the subtext. I'd like to say just something, therefore, briefly, about the aspirations and claims we made over the 40 years. Because it's 40 years, probably more, since historians realized the potential of computer technology for their work. And before then, historians did, in fact, as you well know, seek alternative methodologies, statistics, new syntheses, but the arrival of accessible computer technology, by that I mean localized provision on an appropriate scale, together with appropriate software, led a number of historians in the 60s, led, I have to say, in the first instance, by humanities specialists, but historians gradually explore the potential. Now, I don't want to do a history of history computing, but it is relevant to look at the flow and ebb, and I do use those words guardedly, the flow and ebb of interest, because I'm going to suggest there is an inverse relationship between the growth of technical facilities and digital resources and the decline in the historical skill set to exploit them. What I was contemplating what to say here, thanks very much for the invitation, guys. We tried 5 times, I tried to decline 4 times, but I realized I'd run out of excuses. But I have a collection of books I can't part with, even though it's like keeping old copies of computer magazines going back to the 70s. You look at them and you say, my God, fathers, how did we manage a 16K? Whatever happened to those 10-inch discs and so on? What happened to the Doomsday Project, I ask myself. Fantastic amount of money poured into understanding the data of Doomsday Project, but all on BBC large discs, right? I looked at those books, and I have to say, I've collected all sorts of books about history. They are not gathering dust, because occasionally I pull them down to get rid of the dust. Needless to say, I've checked that it's not a Kindle version for any of them. You can appreciate that. It's not available. But virtually all the books I have were published in the 80s and 90s, with a particular peak in the mid-90s. And that coincided with a huge surge of interest. Computers and Teaching Initiative, which employed a lot of historians. The History Data Archive. Oh, History Data Archive. I sat on the board of that, and the optimism was phenomenal. You know, we were going to change the world. The Essex Data Archive, the Cambridge Demography Group, and humanities computing was everywhere. Oxford, London, Edinburgh, Hull, to say Aberystwyth, I think we were ahead of the game in many cases. And in Leicester, every historian doing honours history had to do a computing history course. That was compulsory for Leicester University. And then the Association of History Computing, which you very kindly referred to, in 1985, chance meeting arising out of a conference, a very interesting conference in Hull, organised by Bill Speck, a man not always given full credit for the extraordinary pioneering work that he did on 18th century data. That Westview conference, which was meant to be for 40 people, we booked events for 40, turned out to be 300 people from 150 institutions and 19 countries. We were gobsmacked. So much so that when we met Oxford University Press, top of a journal, Peter and I met the head of Oxford University Press. They said, how many people do you think will be using computers for history? I said, how many? I said about 5 years, we were 10,000. Probably you think a print run of about 30,000, 40,000 by the year 2000 and so on. I said, God, yeah, it's fantastic. Sounds like a big business. Right, I'm not going to go there. But there were conferences around the world, Montpellier, Bologna, Madrid, Graz, and waves of books. Interestingly, you can still get many of them 8 books. I just managed to get a copy of Lewis and Lloyd Jones' Introduction to Computing for Historians. It cost me 50p plus postage. The books are there, but nobody's reading them. But yet, we believed it was all going to happen. Dan Greenstein, then a lecturer at Glasgow, now of course in Los Angeles, running goodness knows what, said in his book, Historian's Guide to Computing, computers have become the essential item in the historian's toolkit. And he went on to declare that with a parallel development in communication, as he charmingly put it, the last of the computer illiterates approaching workstations, the computer revolution is near complete. That's exactly 20 years ago. Even then, I think Dan could sense a degree, as he called it, of skepticism and distrust. I was called in by my head of department back in the 70s and advised that I really wanted to be a technician. I should go and join a different department. There is no future for this kind of stuff for historians. That's for other kinds of people. That was the belief. I suspect it still is, actually, in some quarters, never mind. And I think we've been massively over-influenced by people like Schlesinger, who actually pronounce that history questions are important precisely because they are not suited for quantitative measurements. Or Gertrude Himmelfarb, history with the politics left out. And I could go on about this, but the reality is that the advent of computer use in history actually began to wane. And while I could talk a lot about the kind of things being said by Konrad Jarasch, Pat Hudson and others, the wave of enthusiasm declined extremely rapidly. It reached a peak and then it simply came off a cliff almost. The original AHC, the Association of History Computing, where we had thousands of members, declined to the point of relocating to the Netherlands. The last conference was in Poznan in 2001. The American AHC was launched in Cincinnati in '86, an online journal maintained in 2010, has come to nothing. And there have been no recent books I can find, I wait to be corrected. People around this room probably are much more up to date, but I've done the searching, I've been everywhere. The most recent, anywhere near the subject, is Willard's book, Willard McCarthy's book, Humanities Computing, in 2005, which is not actually the kind of book that I'm talking about. It's a book about theory. And of course, where are the undergraduate courses? They've gone. There are pockets, Essex, IChem, King's, delighted that King's is still holding the flag firmly. But as far as I can see, and again I would stand to be corrected, I don't think there is a module on computing for historians. Anywhere that I can find, certainly not in the public domain that I can find. Now this is a far cry from Emmanuel Ladourie, the historian of the future. He says will be a programmer or he will be nothing. Well, skeptics have regained the ground. And historiography has generally retreated from the kind of considerations which computing historians were largely interested in. Now, I'm not going to talk about what I believe is a sterile debate over postmodernism, but it's the fact that you have to have a vigorous defence by Richard Evans, to say in defence of history, tells me an awful lot about the state of the subject. And whenever history and computing is mentioned in the reference book, I found 5 of them. They always say, history and computing is what Froebel and Engelmann did, or Goodman did on slavery, which completely misses the point. That is a different subject altogether. That is plyometrics. It is not the same thing. And in the process, I'm sorry to say, the fascinating studies of Greek city-states, the wonderful work on Frankfurt Parliament, we were talking earlier about the port books. I talked to Peter Wakeling only a couple of weeks ago, and I said, where are the port books? There's a wonderful study of all the port books of Bristol to understand the nature of pre-industrial change. Fantastic project. God. It's sitting there gathering dust somewhere. Nobody's using it. Which seems to me, utterly, it's almost as though the work never really existed. All that interesting work. And yet we now have a new voice, which may just trigger a sense of anxiety. You may have started reading, I hope many of you are reading, Thomas Piketty's incredible book on inequality, based on studies of tax returns from 1700 onwards in a number of countries. Capitalism in the 21st century has caused, I think, appropriately, a tremendous interest because of what it's saying about long-term change and a longue durée, if you like to use a French phrase. But he explains, I'm an economist, but in France, economists have no respect amongst the intellectual community, so you have to do something else. You have to acquire other people's skills. And he goes on to say, this book is a book of history, not a book of economics. And, he adds, it would have been impossible without the advent of new computers and new computer technology and communications. Right, now, let me turn to the topic itself, because I'm in danger of wandering to the whole field of what went wrong. But I do think we need to reflect on what happened. Who lost the plot? Was the argument not sufficiently well made, or was it so obscure and irrelevant that people didn't see it was material, the kind of big questions that they want to answer? You cannot answer the question of the cause of the First World War in that way, or understand Churchill's moment of realization in 1940 when he was confronted by Halifax in that famous meeting. Of course, these are only capable very often of being dealt with in other ways. And yet, something happened, whole areas of subject have not been developed. By the way, just to say, there is a flicker of life elsewhere. The US Digital Historians Group is up and running. If you go to their website, there's a small group on computational history. Admittedly, it's only 4 members, but it's only 2 brief comments so far. But Purdue advertising for a digital historian, which I thought was rather good. But generally speaking, my point is made. And yet, suddenly, we realize that all over the web, there are data sets. There are all sorts of things available which you can actually explore and download, even in some cases. And if you've got Athens available to you, you can go to parliamentary papers. Eurodocs will show you huge arrays of materials. So when I want to talk on the eve of the centenary of the outbreak of the First World War, 25 days before the assassination in Sarajevo, even though the BBC actually, from their scheduling, seemed to think the First World War started when Jeremy Paxman opened his mouth in January. They've finished all the story by now, and we haven't reached there. Over the past few years, the tempo of activity in trying to digitize material for the First World War has intensified. And so what I want to do is to look at some of these and say, what are they? What is it about? And then start opening the bigger question of what is the value and what is the materiality of this, for understanding the bigger question. So, you may well be familiar with all of this, and I've put some references at the end which you can pick up. I'm very happy to share with you all the material you want. But Europea, I take it you are familiar with Europea now? Yeah. Okay. This is effectively a federation of libraries and galleries around Europe who are gathering together materials which in fact contribute to a kind of life study of people who took part in the First World War, their experiences. It's a kind of portal for all these things. The First World War Centenary, which the Imperial War Museum are running, of course, as you know, has a whole range of activities. We've got the Lives of the First World War series, discover their stories, remember their lives, who will you remember? We've got the National Archives offering for you to explore their First World War records and encouraging people to contribute more. You've got the British Library with their World War I range of historical sources available with new insights by World War I experts, essays and short pieces. And of course you've got the Oxford Poetry Digital Archive, which is much more than that actually, because it's gathering other kinds of material, not simply poetry, but enables you to look at poets and the rest of it during the First World War. And within that, the Great War Archive, with 6,500 items contributed by the public. Every item related to somebody's experience in the First World War. In Wales, I have to say, I'm sure Andrew would agree with me, Wales has been a little bit ahead of the game in terms of crowdsourcing and other things, because they launched a government-sponsored program enabling people to upload all sorts of material, not just about the First World War, but about the entire history of Wales. This is the crowdsourcing. You can actually upload and say, this is my grandfather's picture down the mines of Tonopandi, and you can put in a little tag, and then people can add information, or you can say, I got this picture, does anybody know what it is? And it grows. It's a people's collection. It's meant to grow, and it's free, and it's available to anybody to add to. You've just got to contact the editors and so on. And in Wales, we run our own website. Again, I'm not going to crow about this, but it's the only dedicated national website at all at the moment. I don't think we'll have any more. Where, in fact, we have news projects and partnerships of all sorts, which, again, adds material about the war and the rest. And down to local level, we've got people like Rhondda. Rhondda Remembers, with all sorts of material about the Rhondda Valley. And I could repeat this across the country, small communities everywhere. The Heritage Lottery Fund has contributed enormously to this, because they are making available substantial sums of money, millions of pounds, to have small projects, to fill in the gaps very often in local knowledge. This is, for example, where you've got a war memorial with just names on it. And they will give project money to enable people to actually find, from their own resources, with that money, ways of enhancing the information so it can become a virtual war memorial. And in Wales, we've given £1,000 to every school to do a local project of a similar kind, a secondary school. In England, we decided to send 2 young people and a teacher to a battlefield. I have to declare an interest. I personally don't think that's a clever idea, but you know, the other 1,200 kids at home may not have quite as much fun as the 2 did. But you know, I'm sure it'll be interesting to see what they say when they get home. And I'm sure it's great for them to go and witness. If you beat the Western Front, but we don't believe the Western Front is the First World War. First World War is far, far, far bigger than that. There were more British soldiers in Gallipoli. You know, what about China? What about East Africa? What about Palestine? But also, it's not just about war, battlefields. First World War is far, far bigger than that. So we want to encourage people to ask questions about change in their community. What happened to housing in their community? All these kind of things, which is about the way in which this may or may not have altered the society we live in. Because, let me just hesitate on this. There is a temptation, has been historiographically a temptation. I think the First World War was a great threshold, which changed so much. And the big debate on the franchise factor was, would the votes have been given to women and to working class people had there not been a war? And that was the great debate we had over the many years before. Is it a process of change or a process of acceleration? Now, I think the Heritage Lottery Fund have done a good thing. I'm not sure many people realise when they pay for their lottery ticket, they're also contributing to these projects, but you know, I think it's very interesting. And then we have, finally, place, for example, in this particular case, the catalogue of the National Library of Wales, journals, newspapers, enabling you to actually search on keywords. And we go back to that, and I'll come to this in a moment. You can search, and then you can find whether it's in a journal or a newspaper, which we've digitized, cross-references to these things, and assemble data sets of that kind. Now, that Welsh experience, by the way, is not confined to one particular thing. It could be anything. You could talk of coal miners. One of the things often we forget about is the reserved occupations of people who couldn't actually go out and take part. Or, and I'm delighted to say, the Heritage Lottery Fund are paying for a major database of conscientious objectors. And all the data relating to tribunals and what happened to them is a very important part of understanding the dimensions of the struggle of conscience of many people. It's not just Kitchener having, calling people to arms. I'm not quite sure what they're going to do with the £2 coin when it comes out of Kitchener's face in it, but that's another story. And then they sent the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Interestingly, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission runs a fantastic data set, but you have to go to Maidenhead to use it. But it's unbelievable. You can chase up all sorts of things, particularly narrowed on that. What many people don't realise is how many memorials are in Britain. There are 7,500 in Wales alone maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Most people don't even realise how much is in their own graveyard. They're all there, but they've just been ignored. And it's interesting to recapture that sense of local engagement. The National Library of Scotland, I'm not going to make a Celtic remark here, honestly. And I did say to Lorna and others, I really am not getting at the Scots, honest. They've got other things on their mind. First World War is irrelevant compared to the referendum coming up. And so they're not doing an awful lot. But National Library of Scotland has digitised a few pictures, and I noticed the top one is a picture of Earl Haig, which I thought, at least you've got pictures of Earl Haig. But that's about it. And in Ireland, well, it's done by the Flanders government, interestingly. It's hosted in Flanders Museum, because they got a slight problem. For the last how many years, there's been a kind of blank drawn over this. There's no war memorial to the First World War anywhere in Southern Ireland. And Catholic involvement was regarded as an act of betrayal. As we well know, that became an issue. That, mercifully, is about to change to some extent. So there's a recognition that you can't rewrite history. What happened before the Eastern Rising of 1916 was a different world. I do love this one, though. This is a poster in Ireland, which I haven't seen before. A recruitment poster. That's how they saw the war. Look at it. Great Britain, Ireland allies versus Germany, Austrian allies. A football match to be played anywhere, somewhere in Germany. Now, what are the themes? Look at the language. Look at the language which runs through all of these. Contribute your own family history. Piano. Piece together life stories. How war affected people. Every item originates from some experience. See how Anthony's story and his collections. In other words, what we have here is material which has been gathered to look at individual experiences, to capture the personal and the emotional experiences of individuals, so that in fact anything to do with that has been added. As the Imperial War Museum explains it, it's the personal response to eyewitness events, tokens that ordinary people have given, so the experience of the war can be passed on to future generations. Intensely personal items, diaries and letters, even trinkets, which were mass-produced and held personal significance. And Lives of the First World War asks, these are 10 of the 8 million life stories waiting. Now, what I think we have to reflect, therefore, is this is a form of digitization which, to me, is a very narrow definition of what digitization actually is. Well, most of these, we could go back and explore actual content. They are images. Very often, images you cannot actually manipulate in any way, except using the metadata tag But generally speaking, you cannot actually do it. Now, I reflect on digitized images, which I mentioned earlier, Manfred Thaler's work, where you could actually look at digitized images and take a shoe in a painting by a 13th century, 14th century painter and trace through whether that was in fact a common theme or a kind of feature or a kind of theme. So you could build a social history through imaging and using computers to help you do that. Now, that was a very exciting idea, but this is very different because most of these images, you can't begin to do that. And at the same time, it's about filling gaps in people's lives, not filling gaps in our information about the war, which is a different proposition. So I've looked around and can't find any data sets which have emerged which actually looks at much bigger pictures, much bigger issues, economic data, or data dealing with consumption of food, or data dealing with all the kinds of things you might want to use to look at the social condition in Britain at the time. That means, if I may move on, that there are technical issues. For example, most of this material is as I've suggested, difficult to capture, but it becomes more problematic than that. If you look, for example, at the National Archives nurses' service records, which have been proclaimed on their website, you can actually search. But it's like a problem. You have to know who you're searching for. You have to have a name. You cannot start off by saying, I'd like to find nurses from Hertfordshire, yeah, or Sussex, to use two places at random, or from Lampeter. You can't do that. You can't actually say, I want nurses who enrolled in July 1915, or in May 1916, ahead of the big push. All you can do is chase the individual records. So even when you've got this kind of search database, it ties into picking up an individual's life, rather than actually enabling you to create a set of lives. You can't then create a subset. You can't do that kind of analysis unless, well, I don't know, maybe you can have a discussion about the value of that. As a result, that's what you get. Fantastic if you're looking for an individual. The record is there, and I've got to take the sample of Marjorie Turton. But there is no way you can search by geography, by date, by anything, just by name. And what you get is the record as is. In other words, what it's done is bring the archive to your desk. But I don't personally call that digitization, not the way I understand it. This is actually enabling you to search in a way that you would have been able to do at any time, but do it more conveniently at home or somewhere else. I think the second, and this by the way, for me, limits massively the ability of this kind of data to add to our ability to do cross-ethnographical work, to trace people, because you also can't make cross-references to these people, to other data sets, and actually build up pictures of the same person, but in different scenarios, different lifestyles. Now, for me, eventually, the great power of the census, when it becomes available in 21, it's available in 11, would be to cross-reference what happens in these cases and the census of 1911. There's one problem with big work to be done on the census, which you know about, ICAM, which is in Essex University, fantastic project, now being online. It's anonymized. They're not allowed to actually put the names on. So that's something. But you then can't cross-reference what's in the census to other datas using names or tags. Yeah? Secondly, I think there's a certain randomness about this. And I'm not being critical, and I hope I'm not demeaning the incredible hard work that's been put in. But it's random. If you say to people, help us fill lives, send us material, what you get are people keen to send material. But that is random. It is not systematic. And consequently, it'll be about the enthusiasm of people, it'll be about their own knowledge. And very often people are not even aware of what's going on. And indeed, out of that we will get the kind of thing you get in crowdsourcing, and that is who is keen, and the gaps will remain. I have to say, also in terms of the UK, since we are still talking about the UK at this date in time, Scotland, as I said, is not involved in this much at all, so you are confined to England and Wales. Beyond this, much of it is in the form of PDF files. I've got a reference here to historic newspapers, which is, again, just like the nurses' records, simply PDF files in this case, again with possibly more traction with a PDF file than you would from a plain image, because you can do something with a PDF file that you can't do with the plain image, obviously, but it's a bit random. But even when one does access, there are often technical limits. I have to say, it took me about 2.5 minutes to load a single PDF file, which you've just seen there, or a single file on Marjorie Burton. It took me 2 minutes, and that was a pretty fast link. I think I'd be running out of breath by the end. The other thing is screen size. I mean, great, but manoeuvring some of this on some of these screens is really quite difficult. And it's a new technique. You have to be able to navigate. It's quite painful, I have to be honest, and maybe it's me, but you know, when it comes to this, it's used well. I find it extraordinarily difficult. Somebody gives me a page of a newspaper, but I can't get the whole page on. They give me a bit of a page, and I have to navigate. Where do you find it? And then they say, oh, you can reduce it to that amount, but then I can't find the story I was looking for in the first place. So it goes in the circularity. But it gets more difficult. I'm now going to be very critical of my own National Library of Wales, because I've taken it up with them, and I'm rehearsing this in private, and I rely on you never, ever to divulge what I'm going to tell you now, because it is still being dealt with. Ambition sometimes, oh Lord, I'll kill me with this. Ambition sometimes exceeds our technical skills, yeah? And I will give you some examples here where I think that what looks wonderful actually may not be quite what it seems. First of all, fantastic. British newspapers online. British Newspapers Online is a resource free. Now, admittedly, you have to have a Welsh postcode, but I'm sure we'll get around that for good academics. But it is free. And Welsh Newspapers Online means we digitise all Welsh newspapers, and I mean digitise them, so that in fact the image has been counteracted with an OCR version of it, so you can search actually properly on the text, pictures, whatever. And all the newspapers have been done. And here we are. So I'm going to search, and what I'm looking for is David Alfred Thomas. Now, I didn't think too hard about David Alfred Thomas. David Alfred Thomas is one of Lloyd George's big sponsors and was a major figure in the coal industry during the First World War. He was a member of Parliament for Rhondda, he was Lord Rhondda, and was a critical figure in the politics of pre-First World War liberal Wales, and I mean a figure who really is now regarded. In fact, somebody went looking for his memorial after the, his grave after the war in the cemetery in Cardiff where he is, and went around the cemetery 2 or 3 times before realising that the huge monument there wasn't a war memorial as they thought it was his grave. That's the kind of size of man he was. If you look, there are 1,670,000 references to David Alfred Thomas. I do have my, can you see it? I do have my little stick, which will point to some of these, because it may be, forgive me, this is a comfort break, isn't it? Yeah, 1,600,000, that's very impressive. Clearly, not all about David Thomas. But as it happens, quite a few actually have come up as MP, so that's pretty remarkable. But if you go further and look for David Alfred Thomas MP, we're down to 336,000. So that's getting somewhere. This is very interesting. And if you go into these, then up will come the story. And there it is. Yeah? and you can see the story highlighted on the computer and the text at the side. I think it's a fantastic step forward. I think it's great. You can actually do incredible searches of that kind. However, if you narrow it to date as opposed to relevancy, and I now want to say, what I put in here was David Alfred Thomas, 1892, yeah? Which seems perfectly reasonable. What comes up? Welsh divorce suit with Thomas D. Griffiths. And then we've got another one which is a bit fun, and goodness knows what the other ones are. Merry Yuletide. Total gibberish, it turns up. In other words, once you start getting outside a very narrow band of searching, you suddenly find yourself in some difficulty. If I look at the Independent Labour Party, which is another of my actual fields of interest, if you look at the Independent Labour Party, lots of good stuff. But if you narrow it to date, up comes parties, Christmas parties, summer parties, labour of love, performance of Shakespeare's Love's Labour Lost. Somehow, once you break outside and you want to try to narrow to get a date or a kind of region, it becomes very, very difficult. And the reason is we haven't been able to develop a software which enables you to do complex searches, which will enable you to actually then create subsets of this 1 million to actually be able to then follow somebody through in these neighborhoods. That's the kind of value I'm looking for from this, not a random search and a random browse. So, I know where my time is beginning to run out. What about accessibility? Now we've seen there's a lot of good stuff, and I really would like your views on this, because I realise you're practitioners, and I may have got this wholly wrong. But I'm yearning for a moment when we can actually take some of this data. I mean, a lot of it is not being digitised. If you look at parliamentary papers, for example, which has been done by Chadwick Healy, which is fantastic to call them up, but actually it's not digitised in the sense. It's images, so you've still got to translate all that material, which is fantastic, in a way that actually enables you then to make use of it. For me, the biggest problem for many people is it's not really accessible, much of the data, only if you pay for it. So if you want to go into the Stolius records, and I don't know if you know about probably know, BD records, the BD set, is the Stolius files which were kept. They're fantastic because they contain the most amazing material. Birth certificates, children's birth certificates, height, weight, religion, the most extraordinary collection of data. Unfortunately, 7 million records. They were bombed in 1941, and so about 2 million survived. They're called the BD series, B, burnt, D, documents. So the burnt document series is now actually available, but only through Ancestry.com. So you have to subscribe. And admittedly, some people say, well, it's not an awful lot to pay, but you're still got to pay. And I think, to me, that opens up an interesting question of what does that actually mean? And if you look at, that's the military records, you have to search, and again, you need to know the name. You don't actually have the ability to look at the categories of people and the rest. And the same with the British Newspaper Archive, which now is available to you in the British Library at £79, £95 a year. In Wales, it's free. Maybe it's a policy thing by different governments. But the reality is, some of this stuff is not accessible. And I fear that as we move along, we're going to find this has become more and more of an issue. Now, let me just, as a conclusion, just say that I think we shouldn't underestimate the scale of developments occurred in communications and in scale of work that's going on. And indeed, I think a lot of the work that is now ongoing may yield results which will actually enable us to progress. But I think that the claim that we have digitized the First World War, I think, is overstated, because we haven't. What we've done is made available materials in some form which can be conveyed through computers and online, but actually it isn't what I call digital material, because material has not been converted in a digital format. Secondly, I think the questions we would like to ask about the First World Order change are not being addressed by the data sets being created. For obvious reasons. You're not going to go to the public and do a crowdsourcing effort and say, I'd like to have all sorts of information about your family's food consumption in 1914. Now that's of great interest to social historians, but you know, families don't keep those records, maybe in estate records. But some of the big questions, therefore, which we have made that we cannot yet reach them. So what we have is a collection of often random, but quite valuable insights into personal experience, very often moving experiences of people. So if you are studying experience and studying the kind of reaction of individuals to this war and the rest of it, then you certainly will get that. I'm not sure what you'll get beyond that, because diaries of people who never went there, or the letters at home of people who actually didn't take any part at all in it, are not, it appears, part of all this search. It's about who actually fought, who actually took part. So we are in danger again of missing whole categories of people whose own experience may not be captured, because of course they didn't keep miners' diaries. That's not something which actually encourage people to do. Soldiers' diaries. So it depends on which part of the community you're sitting where the record actually survives. And therefore we have to still look for a broader spectrum of activity to go there. Will it help us understand the war better? Now that's, for me, the final question. If we are expending effort, to what end? Is it to capture the human experience, or to explain anything at all about the war and its course? I suspect that one of the reasons why historians have not necessarily taken up the digital course is because the kind of questions that Max Hastings or Neil Ferguson or others are asking, I didn't mention Jeremy Paxton because I thought that was a terrible series, but those series which have come out have raised the fascinating questions. You know, what happened in those 30 days? Who took the decision here and there? That carries a lot of resonance for a lot of people. It's a story, it's a very dramatic story, and that is something which you can quite understand. The other is much more systematic. But it comes down to the fact, and this is my final point, that historians are trained, if they are trained, they are exposed to forms of study, forms of analysis, forms of discourse, which do not require the present era this kind of understanding, or indeed the ability to marshal evidence in a way that you can make sense of it. For example, if you were to actually digitize vast records about First World War recruitment, what skills do people have in sampling appropriately to understand the significance of the sample they're doing? What tests would historians be applying to understand whether they've got the wrong sample or the right? These are methodological issues, which are relatively straightforward, but are rarely actually confronted, because that is not in the culture, and that may go deeper into how we actually encourage people to study history in the first place. So for me, what we have is a fantastic array of interesting resources, available if you've got a fast bandwidth and a fairly deep pocket in some cases. You can actually reconstruct, as long as you know the name, the history of somebody in your family who you may or may not have heard of, or somebody in the neighborhood. And if it makes you happy, fantastic. But I'm not sure it adds to some of human understanding. So that's my theme. It's probably no theme I want to be repeating too loudly, because it's sometimes people who are doing this work are very passionate and went into it, will be deeply mortified if it was suggested that some of this was not actually going to add to the sum of human knowledge. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll open straight up to questions. Okay, and then,
I enjoyed that hugely, by the way. But I suppose what I meant...
You're very quiet. I was expecting people to leap up and down and say, oh yeah, I'm used to that.
What in some ways I missed out of that was the last 15, 18 years. And as much as the context which has driven the evolution of all these online resources was actually not academic history. And there's a kind of disjuncture, it seems to me, in your account between, if you like, that academic project which was history and computing, and the digitization of public resources which has been led by the archives and by the public sector, which came out of, in the first instance, that shock when the first census was digitized. We suddenly realized that actually the audience for a lot of the stuff wasn't in the academy at all.
No.
So, I mean, in a sense, I just wonder, isn't there a kind of dichotomy between, on the one hand, the functions that history online is serving in a broader public discourse, which is about community memory, is about people having an engagement with their local past and their local family history on the one side, versus that project of digital history or using digital resources to put academic history on steroids, to put history as an explanatory force forward. And isn't it okay at some level?
Okay. Do you want us to have a to and fro, or do you want to pick up a couple of related remarks? What do you think?
Yeah, we can, whichever you prefer.
I'm very happy to do any. I mean, because the data
If
is...
you want to respond to Tim now, or we can get a few other questions.
Yeah.
Yes, Tim, go ahead.
You mentioned the cost of all this.
Yeah.
I think if you go to the National Archives, sort of ticket, you can access free of charge all the military records.
Oh, yes.
And also the newspaper records are available in British Library.
Yes.
Free of charge.
Yeah.
But I think you emphasise the limitations of all this. As a fellow Welshman, for example, did some investigation in this place called Cros Llanelchridog.
Cros Llanelchridog? Near Penrhyn Dendraeth. Not far from Llanfair Pwllgwyngyll Gygerch mewn dromwr Llanys yn Llanelchridog. Yeah, there you go.
And of course, you realise the limitations of all this, because in Wales, Cros Llanelchridog is a bit of a mouthful.
It is.
The shop to Bros.
To Rose.
Locally, and of course you can Rose. If you can't find what you want on a Rose, you put in Rose, and it brings up every Rose.
I know.
And there must have been about 2 million.
Absolutely.
And but at least it's better than today, 50 years ago, when trying to go through print newspapers.
Oh,
it was a needle in a haystack.
Look, don't get me wrong. I mean, as somebody who actually suffered in Colindale for many years, particularly the time when they denied the fact that you needed tea or anything. They threw you out for an hour while they got on with their own luxury life, and we actually had to find a cafe down the road which didn't exist. I did that, but they were great people, by the way. I mean, they were fantastic Colindale people, but the difference is fantastic. My lungs have recovered, because all the dust from the newspapers. And it's better than microphone, goodness sake. But, and here's the but, not everybody is able to travel down to Kew. Not everybody can travel to the British Library. And the whole purpose of online accessibility and communication is you can do it wherever you like, but at a cost. Now, all right, I may be overstating it. For some people it may not be an awful lot of money. But it is a cost, and that is something which is...
But 15, 20 years ago, you would have to have gone to Kew or Colindale or in any case. So the marginal gain is still there.
The marginal gain is there, and I'm not trying to suggest that we haven't advanced. Of course we have, for goodness sake. Of course I understand that. But it is still a question of what is actually available, and I'm not so sure. You are constrained by what is offered to you. Obviously, if you go to PRO and Kew, National Archives, sorry, I must forget that, you can actually do other kinds of searches while you're there. Very difficult to do that online for all sorts of reasons. It's that connectivity that I'm looking for. Sometimes it's serendipity too, because you don't know quite what you're looking for. And being able to search in that way.
Isn't the fundamental problem, isn't the fundamental problem underpinning all that one about structures of funding for this activity? Well, there's a very good example in terms of those emerging divides. If you look across to the United States, where they don't have the facilities that the JISC have provided us in this country, we're really very lucky. At a place like Manchester, I could buy in these resources because the JISC allows collective purchase. In America, small colleges often can't and will not have digital resources at all because of the lack of those collective purchase agreements. And the patchiness that you're describing, to a large extent, is driven by the different funding structures. In England, the British Library assumes that it can't use mainstream digitisation, mainstream grant money for digitisation, and has to rely on partnerships of the sort that we talked about. Whereas in the National Library, because you're well assembly government, there's that, and with Heritage Glossary Fund, they're going to be aimed at a popular audience. And that leads to the sorts of structures and the issues that Tim described.
All of that is actually true, and I'm not denying for a moment that there isn't a fundamental issue where we actually are trying to square some circles. It seems, however, my central theme, I still want to come back to it and hope you'll have some answer for me, and that is that 20 years ago, when people were very enthusiastic about the potential of this technology, the actual resources weren't available in the same way. We had to go out and create projects to create them. Now that many of the data is available, we don't have the people there to exploit it. I mean, am I wrong? I'm answering your question earlier. I'm avoiding that one.
Can I run past an experience that I've had, which is that in dealing with Ancestry and Cengage Gale and Right Solid, who are big multinational companies who are making a shed of money out of all of this, the thing that's always shocked me is that if, as a historian, you go cap in hand and ask them for the opportunity to use their material as a data set in the way that you want to use them, they actually are really helpful. And that's not that I don't want to defend international capitalism, which we all hope is. I've been waiting for 40 years for it to die. It keeps reinventing itself. But on the other hand, it strikes me that we have to acknowledge that as a result of that mixed economy of funding, which Andrew is talking about, the lottery on the one hand, the archives on the other, and all of that international capitalism, including religious capitalism in the form of the Mormons, we actually have a more digitized past in the UK than anywhere in the world. And that, where I think there's been a failure, is in the inability or the unwillingness of historians to actually make use of that and to turn it to account.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to have an explanation of that. I mean, there's a lot of younger people here who clearly are the products of a more recent experience. But in 1980, you could do a course on humanities and computing at Aberystwyth, and you could do that in a lot of places. What's happened? I mean, is there any views on that?
I'm currently doing a PhD at Southampton. Done an MA in digital humanities at King's. Technical training is frankly, it is lacking.
Really?
Yeah, I use the web. I use blog posts. That's how I learn. That's how I teach myself. I believe there are courses in digital history. I think there's one at Hertfordshire. Units at least.
News to you?
No, I did use to teach it.
All right.
I loved it.
Can I also respond to Tim on point? If you go to Gale's Any of those people, you're Tim Hitchcock who are obeying online.
Yeah,
I'm not a PhD student. There is, and this is actually a question I want to ask you in terms of the talk. Copyright is a real bane, and copyright and money go together. And frankly, what's the point of having skills to do things if you don't have the material to do it on? It's great for the 18th centurists and 19th centurists. But the 20th centurists, and every year for the next, 86 years, it's going to be a centenary of something in the 20th century. That's going to be 100 years after an event, but that doesn't mean to say the copyright has expired. If people wrote at the time but died 40 years later, their counter at the time would be in copyright.
Copyright's covering which categories of material?
Writings, generally. And the First World War is still actually in
Well,
copyright.
okay.
I'll give you an example. One I wanted to raise, and I have to make a cheap jibe. The Oxford World War I Poetry Archive, that's not actually an archive of the First World War, but English poetry.
Or indeed,
If you look at the Dardaists, who are the most important art movement to emerge between 1914 and 1918, virtually none of that work is out of copyright. Handful of exceptions. Most of them had the good sense to get out of the front line, which means they survived the war, which means they died many years later, which means their work is in copyright. Plus, because there was really only one person considered English, and that is a bit of a stretch, because the vast majority of French, German and Romanian, their translations of their work into English are many years after the time they were writing. All of this is in copyright. I can't show Tristan Tzar's how to write a Daedalus poem because it's in copyright.
what are you doing your PhD on?
Nothing to do with the First World War because of copyright. I'm doing a PhD on debtors' sanctuaries in the early 18th
On what?
Debtors' sanctuaries in the early 18th century.
Debtors' sanctuaries?
Yeah.
Where were they hid?
Sorry?
Debtors' sanctuaries?
Sanctuaries, yeah, where they escaped away.
Well, they escaped, yeah. You mean they in West Wales or somewhere?
No, there was one in Wales now.
Yes. But in terms of copyright, is that an issue for digitisation?
It is a major issue. I've guessed there are a number of elements to it though. One is, I think, to note that the curious anomaly of crown copyright has been very liberating for historians because it enables large swathes of the public records to effectively be treated as if they were in public domain. So that's quite extraordinary.
So parliamentary papers would be crown copyright?
I'm not sure about parliamentary papers, material and national archives. I think parliamentary papers are, yeah. So crown copyright is actually an anomaly, but very useful. But in the other materials, it's an enormous problem. The difficulty is that the money is money for the artists. And one, it feels that tension in the digital sphere itself.
But, I mean, there are two sides of that. I mean, one is that a lot of US copyright regulations, which are actually driven by Disney and ownership of artists who you would rather not give any money to in any case, are affecting what we're doing. And the other is that there are actually serious attempts to get around this. I mean, I look at the National Archives' recent big data project, which is designed to identify when people were likely to have died, so that you could then turn around and say, well, actually, that John Smith died in any time before 1944, and therefore all material relating to them can then be allowed out. So there are both clever tricks to try to get around that, and there is absolutely a serious and ongoing problem. And the real problem is, of course, copyright also doesn't work.
Can I just out of courtesy ask, how many people are actually doing research, I think you're doing research, on the First World War? Oh, I could have got away with anything, I think. What are you waiting on?
Well, I work at the British Library. My stuff's mostly 18th century as well. But I mean, one of the things I wanted to add, I want to get away from copyright a little bit. That's right. One of the things I wanted to add was about, I was intrigued that you lingered on interfaces a great deal. And I think so John's comment is interesting, which of course, the interfaces are important, particularly when you're a PhD researcher and your ability to say, can I have that? Limited, and your ability with the copyright problems to actually have it even if you ask is even more limited. But I still think there's a kind of an interesting tension that we don't design interfaces A to last and B for researchers. I think very few interfaces are designed with those categories of people in mind. I think World War I, as we've seen, has been digitised around sort of a sense of public engagement, whatever that means. And that those interfaces are designed to be relatively ephemeral and to tap into a particular type of interest right now, which does so happen to be that thing. And that, I guess, I've never, although it would be great that all interfaces were able to develop, to put in the development costs that would mean that they would be able to serve your purposes. In most cases, I think the development of those things takes place with an eye on, and if it's a problem for this person, they'll ask for the data. And I do genuinely think a lot of institutions just assume, to a large extent, that particularly if they paid for digitalisation themselves, has not been licensed with third party, that researchers who want the data will just get in touch. And in many cases, if there's not licensing problems, they will be relatively open about giving it away. I mean, the British Library, we try. There are copyright licensing issues around some stuff. In most cases, if there's something that we've digitised that we can give away, we will give it away to people.
Can I just pull out one thing which just dawned on me just as you spoke? One of my purposes of coming here is to learn from new people. Even if you're not studying the First World War, which none of us probably are. Nonetheless, I'm interested in your reactions. That's a very interesting point. The interface is designed for a public. It's designed to attract as wide an audience as possible. It's why we worry a lot about the website and the rest of it. We spend a lot of money actually doing that. One of the reasons for that is because one of the key indicators for public funding of libraries like mine and yours and others is footprint. Now, you get a lot of footprint. I've noticed that actually. I've been trying to read in your reading rooms, and unless you arrive at sort of 6 o'clock in the morning, you can't get in there. Now they all do, but that's another story. Time to weed them out. But nonetheless, we have a problem footprint in Aberystwyth, which is not many people live there. And for us, therefore, the footprint on the web is vitally important. So we need to get as big an interest. So you can say, well, maybe only 10,000 people came through the door last year. Maybe a big figure, a small figure. But 1 million people saw our website. Therefore, please continue to give us the money. And I think there is that constraint that we are having to prove that we are actually reaching and showing utility.
But in a way, those metrics are actually not that meaningful either.
Well, I know that.
In a way, actually, from our perspective, we could just sit there and deliver metrics about people using our web services and using the data that we've created on the website. But we'd rather spend time and effort and man-hours developing good stories that come out of actually talking to a bunch of researchers and getting them towards the stuff that they want, and then maybe helping them a little bit, because somewhere down the line they'll say, hey, we did this thing, which is really cool, we're really thankful for you for doing it. And that actually plays better than just the raw numbers.
It plays better for you, but I'm not so sure if the DCMS would be all that knocked out.
I think they help with if it was just the numbers, I don't think DCMS would be happy.
Oh, really?
But that again reflects this issue about underlying differences of funding, doesn't it? Yeah. The National Library of Wales is funded by the Welsh Assembly Government, so it has to feed into the vision of Welsh cultural policy. The British Library is funded by the Ministry of Fun and has to demonstrate that it's reaching as big an audience as possible. The National Archives are funded by the Department of Justice, so it has other pressures. We're in universities all funded by the Department of Business Innovation and Skills.
You're funded by indebted students.
Well,
sorry.
It creates a patchwork of funding that creates a patchwork of audiences, and so it's not surprising that we then get the differences in the type of interface that we were talking about here.
Very interesting. I mean, I'm taking all these notes because I'm going to steal all your ideas. Anybody else doing a PhD on anywhere near this area or doing research?
Sort of tangentially looking at an archive web and a commemoration online as part of the Big Data project. So it will certainly take
So it's archive web.
the web archive at British Library.
Oh, yes,
from
yes, yes.
96 to 2013,
Yeah.
except that looking at commemoration online and how that changes when it's digital. So, but we're just at the start of that. So all these issues are going to be really interesting.
Well, absolutely.
Understanding that financing context is, I think, is going to be really important to understanding what's ended up online.
But doesn't it, again, for World War I, reflect, again, it's about audiences, who's funding it? Your example with the nurses is a very telling example, where you can only search the nurses record if you're looking for individuals, reflects a funding that reflects a drive to support commemoration by individuals, family history.
But there's also there is a market for family historians and antiquarian history, which is much, much bigger than in fact anything.
The key statistic, key fact that historians thinking about these should always bear in mind is that the second most popular use of the web after pornography is family history.
Oh yes, indeed.
It's huge,
I thought it was the same
money.
thing.
Well, it's huge money, which academic history actually struggles to get a look in by comparison. The money involved is such, I actually would have an anxiety as we not list those already, and we'll find that most of the sources that we want are locked down in forms that we don't really like very quickly. Very good example, I think, are the rate books, which have the same problem. They're digitised by findmypast.com. So although I have ancestry selects, it's just, if I want to use a rate book, so I have to have a separate £100 a year findmypast.com subscription. The one in the National Library doesn't let me access the rate books. And that interface is purely for family historians, the rate books and things you want to use in other ways.
Can I just throw another point in? By the way, can I just wrap up? What are you doing?
I'm a historian of modern Ireland, 19th century Ireland.
You come to the conference in September. We've got a big conference in Wales and Ireland in September. Come to Cardiff. You can shout at me.
I'm from the Irish Library.
Are you? I'm sorry to say I was involved in interviewing long-listed candidates for the librarian in the Senate House the other day, and the big question I asked them was, of course you are Irish Library, I remember that, was actually, what is the relation between Senate House Library and IHR Library? And I said, I'm not saying anything.
I'm a PhD student working in 18th century history, but before that I worked in the Major London Archive. And I am London National Archive.
Oh God, nice, yes.
So, I mean, that, interfaces do bother me, because even if I could pay my, whatever it is, to find my past around history, my £120 a year, I still kind of can't go and write more sugar in and a whole list of them. And I can, if I knew Mary Jones as one, that's fine. But, my kind of concern is, at what point could you ever kind of influence that decision, or can you influence that decision about how those records are made available or searched, or kind of, is there a point where historians can say, well, that's names are great, but kind of, how it's, or has that point gone already?
No, I don't think the point's gone around. I think it's a very important point, actually. This is where I think people like the Royal Historical Society and the Historical Association and IHR and everybody, I think people have to say, this is what we want, not what is commercially whatever it is, and and try and find some, because if you don't do that, I think these nurses' records, some of them are absolutely fascinating, but it's meaningless to somebody who wants to study the relationship between geography and typology. That's what we want to pull out, and I think that's the weak link for me.
Yes, and Tim has a certain kind of access to those people, but Tim, how can we capitalise on that? How can the PhD students kind of?
I do think that actually a demand-led process is important. I also think that most of these things have been licensed through, GIST or with the National Archives or the British Library. And they add pressure on those institutions to make sure that the access systems and reuse are available. It's absolutely possible, and they're very open.
But there's a shed load of kind of county stuff now on, ancestry and family past. And how do you get to those kind of county institutions that are kind of, you
You
know.
make sure that the National Library of Wales, when they write their contracts with Find My Past and Ancestry to pay for the digitization of something, actually they'll visit
No, I agree with you. But can I just make one jump point? And finally, I missed you. What
You did. I do many things. I'm project manager of British History Online's.
Oh, oh, very good. Oh, right. That's why you're looking at me, sort of, saying, what's this guy talking about? Do you know what's missing, I believe, in all of this is context. I worry about family history, which is decontextualized. I mean, it seems to me that unless you have the ability to relate some of these lives to the bigger economic, social, and other picture around you, the landowning partnership, all these other things, and that is possible. Maps can be digitized showing the estates, all sorts of things. But on its own, it's just a series of random observations about life. That's fine. But if you want a more rich understanding, I think you have to have context. So for me, the slight worry I have is you read all these diaries, all these records, but you know nothing at all, actually, directly about the context in which this actually occurred. Or at least you have to work very hard to get that. And, you know, we might end up with wonderful, vibrant stories, but they are stories. And I don't think they add to historical understanding. Anyway, I'm sorry to be so pessimistic. I'm not. Oh, National Library is watching. We've met each other before many times. Yeah.
Possibly seen with Welcome Library.
What?
Welcome Library.
Yes.
So I'm a web editor, and the World War I connection is that we just digitised a section of the Royal Army Medical Corps.
That's right. Yes. And the BMA are doing their doctor's records, so I'm told. We're certainly doing it in Wales anyway, because we want to study medical engagement, and that'd be quite interesting to see how that works. Right.
Jane, I think you have a question.
Let's go back to your point about context. And it's something that a lot of the crowdsourcing projects are notably very, very bad at doing. They just treat the volunteers as people who can transcribe things, and you don't need to understand what it is or how it relates to anything else in that collection. And I think, given that they are contributing so much of their time, there's a sort of onus on projects to try to give some of that context to people who are contributing and help them understand the overall project better than they do at the moment.
I entirely agree. What worries me, final thought, is not just the First World War. I think of all that incredible material that's available about the social, economic, and even political condition of Britain in the 19th century, which lies in those extraordinary records, the British parliamentary records. They are, you know, they know more about their people than we do, except, you know, I think in that revenue probably you know more about us than we care to admit. But the fact is that they measured everything. I mean, you may or may not know that when the strikes occurred in the 19th century, they did the most extraordinary record keeping. They recorded, you know, the number of people involved, the number of days involved, when it started, when it finished, what it was all about, how it was resolved, who was in charge, what might. Incredible lines of data you can actually map out. And actually, you can, some of the early projects we did on data set with me and some Canadian scholars looking at the British and Canadian comparison, revealed that actually it's counterintuitive. It is not, in fact, the large pits where there was huge industrial relations. It was the biggest problem. It was often the small ones where, in fact, the owners were being very difficult. There are lots of things you can find out, but you have to know how to handle it. And all I would ask is, and I asked Andrew, I think, at this one point, when is Idealist 3 going to come out?
No idea.
It's gone, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was the best piece of software I ever used for historians. It disappeared 20 years ago. I think I asked you that question. I have a full copy of Idealist for Windows, and I don't have the key. So I've got a lot of gibberish sitting on my machine that I can't tackle, so I need an expert. Has anybody used Idealist in the past?
I remember it being used here a lot for Victoria County.
It was astonishing because you could, with the digital material, assemble incredible cross-referencing and actually create really meaningful sequences of data, up to 99 levels of selectivity, which is fantastic. But it's gone. Because they had no money. And nobody wanted it.
Can I don't want to ignore our online audience, just in case there was a question from either from the Twitter feed or otherwise. No, well then I'm not ignoring our online audience. We possibly have time for one last question if anyone did have anything else, otherwise we're quickly running out of time.
Can I just, one question really is, you focus a lot on interfaces, and I feel like interfaces have maybe are in some ways the past, and what you kind of, I mean, from the perspective of people who are making websites and microsites, what we'd like to do is to have put the data online and have people do their own thing with it. So things like data visualization and text analysis, and then come up with their own, web products and kind of maybe, like an online version or a digital equivalent of an academic paper. Maybe that's where the skill gap is.
I think you're probably right. I think there are many other skill gaps, but I think that is certainly one. But I just feel a sense of slight frustration in it all, because I think the technology is so amazing. But with things available around us we couldn't even dream of. Embarrassingly, I'm still thinking of when I used to introduce computing to historians back in the 70s. I used to say, do you realise this disk contains equivalent of 100 books? I said, good God. And very soon we'll have do you know what a megabyte is? Not a clue, But anyway, I'm not going to go into that. All I'd say is we have advanced, have we?
And on that note, thank you very much, Dan.